let's get to the Daily Fuel right now. And we're starting with this. How about this? The NASCAR team owners boycotted a meeting with series leadership today in a show of frustration over the pace of negotiations surrounding the way the TV revenue will be divided up in their new deal. Now, in response, NASCAR released a statement saying NASCAR is committed to open and productive dialogue on a regular basis with all industry stakeholders. We remain committed to continuing discussions in the spirit of collaboration and with the shared goal of growing our sport for the benefit of all stakeholders. So when you hear that about the boycott, Regan, and then you hear NASCAR's response, what do you say?
Well, I think the first thing we got to say is that this was definitely a meeting that was intended for something other than the revenue sharing and how that revenue gets shared within the sport and how the breakdown is. But, you know, the owners have had an issue with this for quite some time now. They have said we need to adjust this model. We want to see something different. And evidently they feel like their voice is not being heard. So the best option if your voice is not being heard in a situation is to basically try and make your voice heard louder. And I think that was a show of what the owners did today in terms of stepping back, saying we're not going to come to this meeting, which was to discuss other things, until we address this issue first, this revenue sharing issue, which is the primary issue that we want to understand. Josh, from where I stand, this is not different. Other sports this happens in, and it happens in different ways. Maybe in Major League Baseball, it's a walkout or a strike or something like that. We have not seen this in NASCAR, but this is something that has been an issue that's wanted to be addressed for quite some time, and obviously it's becoming a bigger issue right now than it's ever been.
Yeah, and of course, this is a story we're going to continue to follow and stay on top of, and of course, update you as we hear more, but that wasn't the only bomb drop today.
Wait, there's more.
Wait, there is more. So let's get to the Kaulig appeal for the penalty assessed for altered hood louvers from a couple weeks ago. Well, the panel reduced the points penalty from 100 to 75 owner points. However, all other penalties were kept. The 4-race suspension for the crew chief Trent Owens, the $100,000 fine, and the 10 points penalty. Now, a couple things that are important to note. Of course, first and foremost, this is different than what we heard from Hendrick last week, where all the points were given back to them. So that's big to note. It was a different panel that ruled on this one as well, which is different from last week. Now, no statements released just yet. We're going to hear from Chris Rice later on in the show, so that is very important. But first and foremost, I mean, reaction to that, knowing that's different than what happened to Hendrick last week.
I'm shocked, to be perfectly honest. And I want to preface all this by saying I don't know what either team did, right? Then when we hear certain things and different things like that, but without knowing and without being able to see the parts and pieces and see what came off of these race cars and understand exactly why NASCAR said these parts couldn't hit the racetrack or they didn't want them on the racetrack, there's a little bit of a gray area in my mind in terms of speaking about it from that standpoint. What I do know is the understanding was that these were very similar things. They took the same parts off of the same 5 cars, if you count the 4 Hendrick cars, at the same weekend, same racetrack. Everything appeared to be the exact same situation and scenario until we got to the penalties and the appeals today. I think where I sit right now in my mind is basically, why is this not the same penalty as what Hendrick got last week? Why did it not get reduced to the same thing? If it's not going to get reduced to the same thing, why is it different? We need to know what is different to make this penalty different. Why did they continue to get the points penalty that Hendrick did not? So there's a lot of unknowns on this in my brain right now, and it is quite honestly a little bit frustrating. We ask for consistency. We want to see the same thing for every team in the garage area, and whether you're on the side that says the penalty should have stayed the same for all 5 teams that were involved and not been reduced at all, or if you're on the side that says, you know, hey, they should have been reduced or completely gone. To me, it's one or the other. It doesn't. What is the difference based on what took place here?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there is a lot of confusion, right? And I feel like for me as a race car driver, you know, I'm very involved with my team, obviously, with industry. I'm confused. So what can we expect from the fans at home? You know, like I feel like it's you know, I just don't really know how to explain it. I mean, to me, it looks to me that it was a very, very similar penalty. Actually, when I heard the penalty last week from Hendrick, I was like, in my mind, well, why are we going to be even appeal the Kaulig one if it was exactly the same thing and he were with a completely different result? So I don't know. Maybe right now we don't have all the answers. Maybe we're going to get the answers. But as right now, is very, very confusing.
And I do think that's a big key here. Right now, we don't have all the answers. The best way to give us the answers is show us. Show us. Let us see what happened. Let us see why we got to this point. And you pointed out a second ago, the other thing that you got to make sure that you focus on here is it was a different appeals committee. So why did 3 different people hear this appeal and come to a different conclusion? I can't, in my brain, I can't process that right now. And again, this news just came out. So we're all trying to react to something that we're literally getting, a half hour ago. And there's a lot of answers and a lot of questions still that or a lot of questions that need to have answers. Yeah. And it's going to be an interesting week, I think.
And for you, Daniel, as a competitor that now has to go back to the track after seeing this ruling compared to last week, what message is kind of being sent to you and your team and how you process this? Listen,
something that is being consistent about NASCAR is that you cannot mess with any of the production parts. You cannot mess with those parts. And I feel like, most of the teams have been following all these rules because we know the penalty is very big. The inconsistency obviously comes with the penalty. Okay, why the penalty is different, and why Regan and I were talking a little bit ago. Okay, is either wrong or right? Why we are splitting the penalty in half or 80% of the penalty? So, as industry, I know that we're going to get the answers eventually, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but we're going to get the answers. And I know everyone at home wants to also know the answers, but, as industry, we have to understand what happened, why it happened, and how things are going to be moving forward, because there has been some teams in the past that have modified some parts, and they have got 100% of the penalty. So why this is different? So there is, like I said, there is a lot of questions, not all the answers just yet.
And Regan, how does this impact a team like Kaulig versus impacting Hendrick?
Well, I think on the surface, right, Kaulig's a relatively new team to the Cup Series right now. This is their second full season, and then had some part-time racing prior to that. But on the surface, you would say it's not as big of a company. So, and this isn't a knock to the people that work at Kaulig, but I would have to imagine they're not as deep as Hendrick. They don't have the people that are sitting there at the shop that they can pull off the bench and send to the racetrack and say, hey, you know what, we're just going to plug you in, we're going to play. I'm not even familiar with what Kaulig has for a command center, if you will, right? Which is what a lot of these crew chiefs, these Hendrick crew chiefs in particular, have been sitting in to communicate with their teams as they've been serving these suspensions. So now you got a scenario where if they don't have that, or if they have to go to one of their partners to use theirs, it's putting them in a little bit more of a bind from that standpoint. So I think for a smaller team, it certainly affects them more, right? The money affects them more. The points definitely affects them more. And on the surface, every bit of this does, but at the end of the day, I don't know that it's a matter of does it affect them more? Should the penalty be different because it affects them more than it affects a Hendrick or vice versa? At the end of the day, it's simply, why is this different? It shouldn't, whether it's the full penalty, no penalty, or the partial penalty, which I think surprised a lot of us as well, why is it not the same?
Yeah, and we'll be able to ask Chris Rice later on in the show. He's going to join us and answer some of those questions. And I'm sure he still has a lot of questions as well. But, the crazy thing also, the Denny Hamlin appeal is going to be heard tomorrow. So we'll have all of that on the Hub tomorrow as well and see what